begin, I would just like it if you could really just kind of introduce yourself, what you do, who you work for, and let everyone kind of know about you.
My name is Alicia Nicols. I serve as the Deputy Director of the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and Firearms, which is a project of the Battered Women's Justice Project. We are located here in St. Paul, Minnesota, but we do most of our work on a national level. And primarily what I'm tasked with doing at what I'll just call the center from here on out, if that's okay, is that we focus on, of course, the intersection of domestic violence and gun violence. How are firearms used to threaten, control, and to manipulate intimate partners and children in their families? And a large part of what we do is assist communities in the enforcement and implementation of federal law that prohibits domestic abusers' access to firearms, and we help them create the mechanism to actually remove those guns from domestic abusers. Contrary to what people believe, we actually already have the laws that we need on the books to be able to keep domestic violence victims safe from gun violence. But I just want to tell you that the intimate partner violence, domestic violence is so complex. And so we're very fortunate at the Battered Women's Justice Project, in addition to having the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and Firearms, we also have national resource centers around full faith and credit and protection orders, which is significantly important to me because it's one of the avenues in which we can disarm domestic abusers. We also have a national custody center that works around family law and the custody of children. We have another center that will be soon coming on board that deals with criminalized survivors and looks at defense issues. And we also have a program that works on improving the criminal justice system generally. But the majority of the work that we do at BWJP through our national resource centers is the legal arena around family law and domestic violence, and how it is that we can keep women and children in families in safer communities.
You know, there's when you really first dive into guns, there's so many huge kind of topics that kind of leap up first. And I had domestic violence kind of on the back burner. I was thinking well, that's such, like you said, so complex, so nuanced. There's so many different areas. It kind of felt oh, well, guns probably is a bullet point to a larger conversation of domestic violence. Domestic violence probably wouldn't work as well to be a, bullet point of a conversation about guns. But then as I was researching, every major headline, every case, every when you talk about mass shootings or violent crimes, again and again and again, it felt everything came back to, oh, this person had a history of domestic violence or domestic abuse.
Yes.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think domestic violence is really kind of the center of so many of the stories we see in the headlines?
Well, it's a great question. And, what I often tell people is what happens in the home spills out into the street. And what happens in the street, is related to things that are happening at home. But how I actually want to answer this, or how I want to discuss this with you, is even in how we define a mass shooting. And we focus on mass shootings that take place in public places. By definition, a mass shooting is where there is an incident where 3 or 4 people are shot or killed. And but the truth is, Brennen, that 1% of mass shootings occur in public places. The majority of mass shootings in this country take place inside of a residence. And I know that can be mind-blowing for people, and they don't, so I want to help, I want to paint the picture for people as to what that looks like. And it does. It typically tends to be a male partner who is shooting at his current or ex-partner, the children, a new partner a new boyfriend or girlfriend, or a new partner that the ex is seeing, bystanders, first responders, domestic violence calls are the most dangerous call that law enforcement and sheriff's officers respond to. But I bring this up because there are mass shootings that happen every day in people's homes, and we don't call them that. There are mass shootings that happen every day in places that people refer to as the hood, and we don't call them that. we call them gang violence, right? We tack it on to something else, and we move on. And so I think that we first even, so yes, we do know that there is a connection between mass shooters having a history of domestic violence. The numbers speak for themselves. We know it's high, but I also, I think it's really important that we take a step back, and that we also that we redefine how we look at mass shootings, so that it can give us some more insight into how do we keep people safe. And I'll tell you, oftentimes, there after the Pulse shooting nightclub in Florida, that shooter had a history of domestic violence. It was documented. His victim, his wife, received a lot of pushback and threats and victim blaming around why didn't she do something to stop that shooting. And victims cannot be canaries in coal mines. Right? We have to be really careful about placing the burden upon them to be responsible for all of community safety. And this is even, I think we'll have an opportunity, and maybe more another time as well, to talk more about extreme risk protection orders, or what are known as ERPOs. And there is an idea that an ERPO essentially it's a form of a protection order that in some states a family member or police or in some cases mental health practitioners can petition for the court to remove someone's gun because they believe that they are a threat to themselves and to the community.
Sure.
And often in those cases, guns are removed. But I'll tell you, Brennen, when a victim or a survivor goes to the courthouse and files for an order for protection, or there is a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, both of which prohibit someone from having access, the courts aren't requiring surrender of those firearms. And so if you can see what message does that send to survivors about, and I think that we have focused in society, and I know we're going to talk more about how the general public even looks and thinks about domestic violence, but I think some of what the issue also is that people are for the mass shootings that take place in movie theaters, at churches, at schools, in public places, we often see those victims as innocent. But we don't consider victims of domestic violence as being innocent. We place the blame on them for being responsible to end the violence that they're experiencing, when we know that when survivors try to end the relationship, when they try to leave, we know that that's when the violence escalates, and women and their children die.
So often when you hear about cases of domestic violence, I mean, for one, just the way you read about the difference in a school shooting or a shooting at a church or a movie theater, and then the way you hear about any sort of domestic violence is very different. I mean, one is probably going to be on the front page. One is going to be probably buried if talked about at all.
Right.
But then when we actually talk about the victims of the violence, why do you think there is such a discrepancy in how they're talked about and then how they're perceived by the general public?
And I can only speak from the experience that I have of having been an advocate for 20 years and working with victims of domestic violence and sexual violence, but also surviving family members of those whose lives have been taken by homicide. I think that the general public, but also in my experience working with criminal justice professionals, and by criminal justice professionals, I mean judges, prosecuting attorneys, law enforcement officers, we're looking for physical signs of abuse. We're looking for black eyes. We're looking for bruises. We're looking for signs of physical injury to believe that, to let us know that something is wrong. And if anyone is familiar with the Power and Control Wheel, which was created here in Minnesota, so many great things have come out of Minnesota, the Power and Control being a tool at a period of time that really shed some light on what the tactics of abusers were and what it looked like in the lives of women. And what I will say to you is that the general public, like I said, criminal justice professionals are looking for those physical signs of violence and oftentimes are not going to see them. because the abuser is only going to resort to physical violence or to sexual violence when the other tactics in the wheel, right, the power and control wheel, don't work. And what I mean by that is I don't actually have to fire the weapon. I can just brandish the weapon, right? And I can threaten and I can manipulate and I can coerce you to do things without having to physically touch you. And oftentimes I can manipulate and use the children to threaten to take away the children, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, verbal abuse. There are all of these other tactics that abusers use that aren't illegal, Brennen. Right? It isn't necessarily a crime. And I want to give you an example about this and why context and asking more questions is so important. So we have a victim who has a protection order against her ex-husband. And one day she goes out to her car and she locks her car every night, but she goes to her car and there is a cup of coffee, her favorite cup of coffee, in the center console. And she calls law enforcement and says, "There's a cup of coffee in my car. There's a cup of coffee. He put a cup of coffee in my car." And an officer may not see that or understand that as a threat without understanding the context of the violence that person is experiencing. Yeah. And so that person may say, "It's a cup of coffee. You should be, right? Great, you got a free cup of coffee." But in reality, what it means is, I know where you are. I know how to get into your vehicle, right? I know how to access you. Right? It's a threat, but it doesn't necessarily break the law, but can be just as threatening, right? And so I think that there is a real misunderstanding about how intimate partner violence plays out. And I also think that there is a lot of the burden is placed on survivors and victims to keep themselves safe. And there is a belief if the violence was so bad that he or she would just leave. But again, Brennen, we know when women or intimate partners are trying to flee a domestic violence situation, it's when their lives are taken. It's when the children are killed. And so we really have to pay close attention to what the context and the lived experiences of that violence are. And we need to listen to the person who is the expert of their experience. And that is that victim and survivor. And, Brennen, there are times when I work with survivors and they say, "If you remove the gun, he will kill me." And that's a real conversation that we have to have about then how are we if we don't remove that gun, how are we going to keep you safe? How do we safety plan? How do we, if you so choose to leave the relationship, how can we do that with you safely? But I just think there is a real misunderstanding. I think that the general public thinks that domestic violence is an anger management issue. And I will tell you that abusers often are very intelligent, very charismatic, right? They have the ability to oftentimes control themselves in many different situations. They are employed, they go to work, they go to movies, they go to concerts, they do things with friends, and they can control themselves. They choose to use violence, whether that be physical, emotional, spiritual violence, with their intimate partners and with their children.
I think there's something that I've heard said, and kind of is mentioned here and there is like the idea of, well, the best way to protect yourself in an instance of domestic violence is to get a gun yourself.
More guns.
Which, to me and my sensibility seems really, really wrong. But at the same time, I've never been in a situation where I have felt physically threatened.
Exactly. Right.
Other than like second grade. It's one of those things where it's like it's never been life threatening. And so
Absolutely.
I don't want to discredit it because of my own privileges, but I also don't want to just go, well, guns have to be the answer then. So I mean,
yeah, right. And we have more guns in this country than we do people.
Yeah.
We have more civilian-owned guns in this country than guns that are owned by our military and our law enforcement. Like, think about that for a minute. More guns than our law enforcement and our military. And we have more guns, civilian-owned, than any other place in the world. We love our guns.
Yeah.
And So you're right. I hear that all the time. Just arm everybody, and you're right. It is there. It's very nuanced. There are lots of complexities, as there is in everything, right? And so there is no one size fits all solution, right? Like that is another important piece of this. But I also want to share with you that we saw a spike in gun sales at the beginning of COVID. In March of 2020 and on. I mean, record numbers of gun sales. What we also found was that there was there was an influx in first-time purchasers. And so then we started to look at who are those purchasers. And I mentioned COVID, right? And so what we found was that there was a percentage of those first-time gun owners, or purchasers, that were Asian Americans. And at the time, right, we know that Asian Americans were experiencing and are still experiencing hate crimes at alarmingly high rates, right? And so so to your point, you were right. Like, how do I argue with someone about that? They're thinking that might keep them safe, right? And there are lots of situations. I have a friend of mine who grew up on the south side of Chicago who will tell you, Alicia, he said to me, growing up, I couldn't get an avocado, but I could get a gun, right? And so accessibility is an issue as well, but. What we actually know, though, is that introducing a gun into a home where there isn't violence, where there is not violence, increases the likelihood of homicide occurring within that home. For women in domestic violence or intimate partner violence relationships, the presence of guns can increase their likelihood of homicide by 5 times. There are other studies that have come out within the last year or two that actually indicate that it increases by 11 times. So, but again, even if there isn't violence in your home, there is an increased risk of homicide. We know that for men who bring home guns within the first year, I believe it's ridiculously high, but the amount of the likelihood of suicide is what I'm trying to say. The likelihood of suicide increases like by 7 times. I mean, it really is alarming. But we also know that there was a study that came out of California, I believe it was last year, where they analyzed handgun purchases and couples in homes, and if people in that home were more likely to be murdered. And in that specific study, women in homes with handguns were 3 times more likely to be murdered. There's another study that came out, I believe it was around 2003, and I can make sure I get this to you so that your listeners will be able to research this for themselves, because I want people to know where to find the data. But we know that the data suggests that that women who purchase guns for safety are actually more likely to be murdered with that gun by an intimate partner. And so women bringing guns into homes, even the FBI, there are reports that when people state that they buy guns for protection against crime, that is actually not what the gun ends up being used for. It ends up more likely to be used to kill an intimate partner. So, I also will just say that, I'm going to be really candid and really honest that stand your ground laws only work for one person in America, and that is white heterosexual men, right? Stand your ground laws don't work, certainly do not work for people who look like me and women of color. We know that there are women who are currently incarcerated, who are survivors of domestic violence, who've killed their abusers. There is a case, and I feel awful. I feel absolutely awful that I can't remember her name right now, but she was a woman who was living in the state of Michigan. I believe she had like a ruptured spleen, a broken leg, and a broken arm when she shot and killed her abuser, and yet she is sitting in prison. Right? You can't tell me that wasn't a defensive gun use, right? But still, here she is now incarcerated. And I want to be really clear. At the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and Firearms and BWJP, we valued life. And so we care just as much about the safety of victims and survivors as we do about men and about men who use violence. We don't want them to take their own life either. And Brennen, murder-suicides are something that is another, right, is that oftentimes men will kill their partner or kill the children and then turn the gun on themselves. We also know that 60% of these homicides occur during the course of an argument. And so what that tells us is that the accessibility of the gun is also an issue. And so we know that it is there's an argument that is occurring. There isn't the commission of any other crime that's happening, and yet someone is able to get a gun, and and it's effective. We also know that guns are used more to kill women than any other weapon combined. There's something that's also, Brennen, that's called the substitute or the substitution effect, right? Which is this idea, because oftentimes, the first question I get is, why don't we arm victims? It's followed up by, well, if we take the gun, they'll just use another weapon. And what we know is that that's not the case. It really is about the accessibility of the gun. We know that removal of the firearm and the handgun, it does save lives. It makes a difference. But arming yourself is not going to be the way that you keep yourself safe either. So it is a nuanced, complex conversation that we do have to have with survivors.
No. To that idea of what you said, the substitution
effect, yes.
Effect. I'm blanking on what, pick any multitude of cases. But I think, I believe it was a few years ago, I think it was in Japan, someone on a subway attacked just passerbyers with a knife. And I think, the right-wing news outlets kind of went on, well, you see, Japan has all these gun laws, but look, someone, and I was like, yeah, but it was 3 people, and it was about 5 minutes, and then the person was subdued because it was a nut, the idea of when there's such an argument of well, anything can be a weapon, if you have ill intent. And I'm like, I would love it if anything else than a gun. Or a pencil.
Guns are incredibly effective, right?
Yeah.
They are meant to kill.
If I had a list of what I could choose someone to potentially attack me with, I would choose anything before a gun.
I'd be thinking
probably.
like a toothpick.
That would be a great thing, other than a gun, to be used.
Right.
Because that's not going to go. It's such a straw man argument.
Yes.
Of just anything's a weapon. Because of course it is, but the effectiveness, you see the effectiveness is so much less.
Exactly. Yes.
And it's such a infuriating. I can only imagine. This is your life. You're working with people with this wide variety of beliefs and feelings and.
Yeah,
so thank you.
I do what I can. I do what I can. And, I have, I couldn't sit here, I couldn't have this conversation with you if it weren't for all of the victims and survivors who have been impacted by gun violence, who have shared their stories, right? The most intimate and most heartbreaking and devastating moments of their lives. And I said something to you earlier before we began our interview in our discussion tonight about how I've been doing this work for 20 years, and a lot of what we're still talking about right now is what I was talking about 20 years ago, and it makes me think about a woman who I consider a good friend of mine who was separated from her partner, it was her ex-husband, and they had been separated for quite an amount of time. And the system failed her. She did everything that the system asked her to do, everything, right? She was, quote unquote, the good victim. She did everything we needed her to do. And yet her 6-year-old daughter, Michaela, was driven into the state of Wisconsin and shot to death by her father, who then turned the gun on himself. And it is the conversations that I have with women like Lee, who have lost their children, that make me want to continue to do this work, that we can't give up, because I know that we can do better. But it is, I will tell you that it is frustrating. It is frustrating, especially when I know that we have a mechanism and a tool already in place to keep people safe. And we don't use it. We don't enforce it. And so that is part of why. So thank you to you for providing the space and the forum to be able to have this conversation, because, in my office, we really talk about this as an open secret, that, right, people know that violence is happening within homes, and yet people don't, for a variety of reasons, don't want to get involved, don't know, right? Don't think it's, in fact, I giggle a little bit because it's so preposterous to me. I also work in sexual violence, and I was back in the town where I grew up, and I was talking with the mother of a friend of mine and telling her what I do, and she was like, sexual violence, that still happens? You mean like rape? Does that still happen? And I was like, where am I? Like, right, absolutely. And so we have to talk about this. And anytime survivors and victims share their stories and talk about this, it is a gift to all of us, because it is a call for us to do better, and we owe them that. And I truly do believe that we also owe it to people who use violence. We owe it to them as well to help them figure out why it is that they're using violence in the first place. Because Brennen, we can have every law that we want in the books, and I won't get too into the weeds on the criminal justice system and reform, but the criminal justice system serves a purpose, and it is not about prevention. It is what law was broken, who did it, and what's the punishment. Right? And so our criminal justice system isn't looking, nor is it interested in what are the root causes of violence. And I bring this up to you because there are lots of survivors who will say to you, I don't want to leave my partner. I want the violence to stop. And we have cultural responses in the domestic violence movement, in the intimate partner violence movement, that have really propped up the thoughts, feelings, and needs and desires of white victims and of white female survivors. And if we can do that for them, I believe that we can also then come up with other cultural responses that fit the needs of people that live in a variety of different ways, and right, and there's intersectionality in a variety of different things that come into play in a person's life that impacts how they make decisions. But for some survivors, they just want the violence to stop, and they want their partner to get help. And so I also think it's really important that we don't dehumanize or demonize people who use violence in their relationships. We have to believe that they are worthy of saving and of redemption, and that there's the possibility of change. Because if we don't believe they can change, then what the hell are we doing?
Yeah.
What are we doing? And if we don't, we can have a victim leaves and she's safe. She might be safe, but the abuser, the person who's using violence, is going to move on to somebody else.
Not one size fits all, or one, but like, what is in your opinion, like, what are the pathways for helping the abuser get the help they need to not do this anymore? What are the reasons, and what is some of the solutions?
Well, I think that we need to redefine, and we need to redefine what justice means and what accountability means, and I think that needs to be led by victims and survivors. It needs to be, and I don't just mean victims and survivors of domestic violence. When we're talking about violence overall, the people who are closest to the pain need to be a part of the solution, and what their needs are to heal. Right now, what we do is we hurt people who hurt people to teach them that hurting people is wrong, and it's not working. I don't know. I worked in corrections for 6 years in this state. There was no domestic violence programming. Men or women weren't coming to prison on domestic violence offenses. They were coming on things like assault, drugs, and weapons. And we're not screening or looking at those histories of domestic violence. And if we do know that they have domestic violence, or potentially when they're sentenced to the Commissioner of Corrections, they may be told, well, you need to go to anger management. Domestic violence and intimate partner violence is not an anger management issue. Anger management is not going to solve misogyny and sexism and racism and all of these other things that prop up violence in families. And so I also think that people don't have their basic human needs being met. And that is something that we need to discuss about equal access to education, to healthcare. And I want to be clear, too, that it isn't only the responsibility of the criminal justice system to respond and to prevent violence. Right? I am a social worker. I need to hold my own people, my own field accountable. Social services has a lot that it needs to do around these issues. The healthcare industry is can't escape this either. You know, I think my nurse probably hates me. I probably drive her nuts because every year when I go for my annual physical, there's a question that I get asked about whether or not I feel safe in my home. And I always say no. And there's never a follow-up. I mean, every year, right? If we are going to ask if someone feels safe in their home, or if there's guns in the home, right? If we're trying to assess needs and safety, we have to be willing to provide the resources and to have the conversation, or we're falling short, right? And so healthcare, we have to start, we have to start working in that arena too. ER doctors can be incredibly insightful into helping the rest of us understand what their shift looks like when people are coming in with gunshot wounds. We know in this country that, right, the CDC just released, we live in a country where we say we care about children, yet we're fearful to send our children to schools, and we know that the leading cause of children is now gun death.
Yeah.
So I know I'm probably getting off on a tangent, Brennen, because I can talk to you about this all day long, but I think that we make a lot of assumptions about why people use violence, and we've not done enough to include them, people who cause harm, nor do we include victims and survivors enough in the conversations, right? I do believe that communities have the skills and the tools that they need to survive and to thrive, and they aren't always listened. They aren't always listened to. But we do need to listen to those that are closest to the pain to identify the solutions, and provide better resources and services.
Just, you mentioning, that a root cause is healthcare or education. There's no end to problems, and they're all connected. Yes. I can't talk about guns without, like domestic violence. You can't really talk about domestic violence without talking about education or healthcare. And anyone knows how just deep and vast those subjects. It's just like.
Right, and then you've got suicide and storage and gang violence and all of these other safe storage and accidental shootings and injuries, and it's complex, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do something or that we shouldn't try.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
We have to try, and that's really what I'm asking people to do is try. And we have federal law, and several states, over half of the states, have state laws that prohibit the access of firearms by domestic abusers. So federal law is 922 G8 and 9. And G8 refers to if you are the respondent of a protection order, you have lost the right to possess a firearm. In 1996, we passed the Lautenberg Amendment, which meant that if you were convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, you lost the right to have a firearm. There are 9 categories of prohibited parties from having firearms. 2 of those are domestic violence classifications, right? Protection orders and misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence. So we have the laws that we need to keep people safer, right? And unfortunately, what happens is communities are rarely implementing and enforcing those laws to the full extent that they can and should. And also, unfortunately, the federal law and state laws address the prohibition. What they don't do is provide the mechanism for surrender. And so that's a lot of what I do in my work across the country, is to go into communities and help criminal justice system professionals, domestic violence advocates, implement the actual mechanism to get the guns removed. And it is, we have what we think is really 4 steps to being able to do that. And that, I mean, anybody can do this. You can go and you can, if you are, you can go in your community, you can go to the courthouse, you can attend a protection order hearing. And I would encourage people to listen for one, is the reason that people are in court that day, the case that's being presented, does that render somebody ineligible to possess a firearm? The second question is, does this person have access to a firearm? Actually asking the question, do you have a firearm? And it's interesting, Brennen, because we get a lot of pushback on this, so that, they'll just lie. Right? They'll just lie and they'll say they don't have a gun. Well, there are other ways that we can determine. Right? We live in the great state of Minnesota, where I don't necessarily, but we have a lot of hunters here. I might be able, if you tell me you don't have a gun, but you've been purchasing a hunting license for the last 6 years to kill a deer, what you killing that deer with? How you killing that deer? And you know what? Fishing is a lot of fun too. You can always go fishing. So, and then so it's asking that question, do you have a firearm? And then relying on other resources to identify if that person is in fact in possession. And I just want to be clear that doesn't mean that the victim is our best source of information, because it jeopardizes his or her safety as well. Sure. But the third step is, and if we know that the person is ineligible, we know that they have a firearm, then I need a judge to write a clear order that you are to surrender and where to go to do that. And it needs to be either the local sheriff or your local police department. And the fourth and really critical important step, Brennen, is compliance. Is that when a judge orders surrender, that judge needs to make that individual come back to the court on the record and prove with an affidavit that they have in fact dispossessed themselves of their firearm. And that's oftentimes what happens, is that compliance piece is missed. I was contacted not too long ago by a man whose mother and sister were murdered by his sister's husband. And this also speaks, Brennen, to defensive gun use, is that this couple, this husband and wife, were avid gun owners. They went to the range together. They fired their weapons together. They target practice shooting. I don't always have all the right words. But they would do that together. And so she did have a gun, and she did have a protection order. This individual drove to a local store and bought rope and gasoline, and he went with the plan to abduct her and to kill her. And when she came out of her house that morning, she saw him. She ran back into the home, and she got her gun. And she did actually fire at him, but he outgunned her. He had a shotgun. And so he killed her. He first killed her mother, and then when she had her gun, and then he killed her. So she did have a gun, and she's still not here. And the judge in that case didn't order a compliance hearing, right? And if he would have, it's possible that she and her mother would still be alive. No, it's possible that, it is possible that that individual was so set on causing harm and destruction and violence and death that he would have still been successful. But if we would have had a judge, in that case who would have made that individual come back on the record and confirm that he had in fact dispossessed himself of his guns, that if he did in fact do a third-party transfer, which is where you can give the gun to somebody else, that the person that he gave the gun to understood the magnitude of why that gun was being removed in the first place, and also what it would mean for them if he got that gun back, right? And so I choose to believe that there is a possibility that she and her mother would still be here, and that family wouldn't be grieving.
I know that you say you don't want to get too into laws and policies and stuff, but why do you think it is that there is such a critical missed, fourth step, or the compliance, or that what you said, the mechanism of why do you think that is such a huge issue when it seems like it's all set up in terms of how the law is written and what is, in my mind, as someone who, is not exactly an expert, it seems pretty common sense of let's do all that we can to make sure this person does the thing that we are saying they should do.
Well, I think there are a variety of reasons, right? Again, nuances and complexities. I feel like that's sort of the theme of our conversation. Maybe that's what we should call this the title of the episode. But there's a variety of different reasons, and it is victims are afraid to disclose. It could be that the person who would need to dispossess themselves with a firearm needs that firearm for employment, which impacts the income, right, that the survivor needs for her and her children to survive. The Second Amendment is something that comes up quite a bit, and around the Second Amendment is the judges and law enforcement are concerned about the authority they have. So while we've got the laws that we need, they still question whether or not they have the authority to remove the firearm. In many instances, of course, they do, right? They do, right? And then there also are instances that come into play around the definition of domestic violence, of battery, right? There's a relationship category that can also come into play, and which is, I'm going to call it the relationship loophole, but it tends to be called the boyfriend loophole. But right, that it also there are we've now made it so that in the Bipartisan Community Safer Communities Act, which Biden signed in June of this year, or July, June or July of this year, addressed that relationship loophole or that boyfriend loophole by clarifying what the definition of a relationship is. So we now have a better understanding and definition for misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence and firearm removal, but we don't for protection orders. And so that's still, right, it's a critical issue, Brennen, because we know that over half of domestic violence homicides with firearms are happening in dating relationships. And so even, right, it gets to some cases where the relationship, right, maybe doesn't meet the statute for firearm surrender or removal, but the Second Amendment is something that always comes up. There is still right. Judges, attorneys, law enforcement officers are human beings just like everybody else who have thoughts and feelings and value systems and morals, right, that shape how they make decisions. And so, right, going back to, right, oftentimes if there aren't physical signs of violence, we may not think that it raises to the level of needing that mechanism or surrender. And in fact, the case I shared with you earlier about the mother whose daughter was killed, her ex-husband had threatened many times to kill her. And when she spoke to helping professionals who were supposed to make decisions to help keep her daughter safe, the response to her was, "He threatened to kill you. He didn't threaten to kill your daughter." He still killed her daughter, and she would have been 24 this year. So, it, again, nuances and complexities, but, I also hear, that there are criminal justice professionals who say, I don't want to violate anyone's constitutional right. Like, I don't want to be the judge that violates someone's constitutional rights or right, that by taking somebody's gun. And I want to say, the flip side of that. So you want to be the guy or the woman that sits on the bench that allows intimate partners to terrorize and shoot and kill their families with guns. That's the flip side of that. That's the only way I know how to say it. Do you want to be, and a lot of these, these are elected positions. And so people get concerned about, right, what is the risk? Is lethality really an issue? Is the violence really that serious? Why doesn't she just leave? If the violence was so bad, she would just leave.
Yeah, and it seems to me like worst case scenario on one side is we took someone's gun away outside of the realm of the law and let's give it back because we messed up and here's your guns back. And the flip side of the other side is, well, ends in tragedy and death. And that's not something you can...
I can't restore life.
You can't restore that.
I can't give life back.
You can't
as
flip
much
that.
as I would love to.
Yeah.
For many of the victims I've worked with, I can't do that for them.
So that to me just seems like such a weird disconnect in the thinking of like, I don't want to mess with gun rights and the Second Amendment, and I don't want to accidentally take away anyone's guns who have a right to that gun. But I'm like, just if you realize you don't have it, give it back. That seems very doable.
I know. I sit at my desk a lot, Brennen, and I'm like, this is a puzzler, right? And I don't mean to joke, but sometimes, I mean, it just is. Some of this just seems really glaringly obvious, right?
Yeah.
It's life or death.
Yeah.
It's as serious as it gets.
Well, and it boggles my mind that so often the default is let's be careful and let's protect guns.
Yeah.
Let's protect these gun rights.
Yes.
Let's make sure that is
Let's not protect families and children and our communities, right? Because again, we know that we know that what happens in the home spills out into the streets. Right? We know that as I said, while the majority of mass shootings are happening in people's residences, they do happen in public places, right? We know it happens, and so it certainly seems to me that firearm removal from domestic abusers is certainly a way to reduce more public mass shootings and to keep all of us safer.
Yeah.
I know it seems so simple.
It really does.
And I know, and I'm saying that very nonchalant, like, oh, it's just easy to do. And it does have its complexities, as we've said. And there are, right, we do need to listen to victims and survivors about the lived experience and the context of the violence. I would also say that we need to bring into this discussion and conversation men and women who have used violence in their relationships and with their families to understand how it is that we can break through that, right? How do we figure out what has happened, not what's wrong with you, but what has happened that has allowed you to make decisions to harm yourself, your family, your loved ones, right? The broader community, it's this ripple effect. Who hurt you? What happened? And it's never a justification of the harm, but we do have to understand where someone's thinking is and where it's coming from to understand how we can more permanently intervene and change behavior. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to see people cycling in and out of prison from relationship to relationship, and people living in violence. And we can do better. We deserve better than that. We all do.
What do you think are some things that the general public can do to learn more, do more? I mean, how can people get involved and actually work towards making change?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing that I want to say is, right, is if you have experienced violence, if you know someone who's experiencing violence, right, to find someone that is safe for you to talk with about that, whether that be an advocate, and as much as you can in a safe way, right, try to seek help and to figure out what that can look like for you. But I want to caution the helper friend and how it is that we talk about how we talk with people who are experiencing violence, right? The language that we use matters. If we demonize, we dehumanize, right? It isn't uncommon for survivors to sort of recoil, because if you think all of these horrible things, right, about my partner, what might you then think about me for being here, for staying, right? And so, so I encourage people to understand the nuances and the complexities of how violence shows up in people's lives, and to try to suspend the judgment as much as possible. And so I think that by doing that, right, you will acknowledge and can figure out that you may not be experience, or it may not be appearing the way that you think it's going to in that physical violence, right? And so, I would also just say, know what's happening in your local community. Know if you have a state law that addresses firearm prohibition for domestic abusers. I mentioned, going to the courthouse and seeing what's happening. Ask those questions. You are a citizen in your community. You elect those officials. You have every right to know what's being done, what decisions are being made to keep people safe. And I want to be very, very specific here about what decisions are being made to keep who safe, who is worthy of safety, who gets safety and protection in this society. So that is something, I would encourage people to understand. You can go to your state domestic violence coalition and they can tell you what domestic violence fatality looks like in your state, to tell you the scope of the issue, right? Not because we have to have 50 or 100, because one gun death is enough for us to move to action, right? Somebody loves that person. And so I would say get involved in your local community, whether that be volunteering with a domestic violence shelter, but even just also being willing to have the conversations, right? Shame likes to keep us in the dark, and shame is so much a part of violence. And so I think, how we can show up for people, and there's a colleague of mine, I just thought of this, there's a colleague of mine who is a fast pitch, like softball coach for her daughter, and she took a softball to the eye, and she had a black eye, and she went to go train judges and cops for 2 days. She had this huge black eye, and none of them asked her if she was safe. Nobody inquired, right, about what was happening, right? And that was a sign of physical violence, right? But nobody asked her what was happening. And it wasn't until she went out to dinner later on in the evening with one of her kiddos that she went to go fill up her soda. And another gentleman in the restaurant got up and followed her and engaged in conversation with her, something like, well, that's a shiner you got there. Right? And anyway, he was able to ask her in such a way that was very comforting and supporting if she was safe. And so, right, so even I would encourage us to challenge our indifference. Right? We like to say that domestic violence and intimate partner violence is a family issue. Intimate partner violence impacts all of us, and we all have a role to play in reducing intimate partner violence, in reducing gun violence, and keeping survivors of domestic violence safe from gun violence. We all have a role, and you don't have to march, you don't have to protest. It doesn't have to be a grand gesture. Sometimes just questioning and inquiry is what it can take to get the ball rolling. So I would say, suspend judgment if you can, in your indifference, and be inquisitive and ask lots of questions and figure out what is happening in your community, because whether you believe it or not, it is impacting you. It impacts all of us.
There's no end of thanks I can give for you, for the work you and so many other people are doing, and the lives that I know you're changing and helping. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for providing the platform and the opportunity to have the conversation. There's a lot of work to do, but I'm confident that if we all can come together and talk about the solutions, that we can and we will do better. So thank you so much for the platform, for the time, for the space, and for the great conversation. I certainly appreciate it.